Thank you very much, Jim, and it's extremely exciting to see so many people here. And it's a great pleasure and honor to welcome Professor David Harvey to the Penn Humanities Forum. David Harvey is unquestionably one of the leading scholars in the humanities today, and certainly one of the foremost social theorists working within the Marxist tradition. If I may share with you a brief confessional moment, I want to say that his work has been a great inspiration and source of instruction for me, but also something of a vexation. I've just completed a book on post-Marxist theory, and whenever I turned to David Harvey's work, I felt that the whole premise that somehow Marxism had suffered a fatal blow was shaken by the rigor, the comprehensiveness, the vitality, and the urgent relevancy of David Harvey's work. And any time one looks at his work, one also sees that he destroys any facile cliches about leftist dogmatism. In his hands, Marxism becomes a supple tool of analysis, and his work becomes a model instance of the possibility of combining passionate engagement with cool level-headedness, utopian optimism, and balancing realism. David Harvey is the Distinguished Professor of Anthropology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He received his PhD in geography from the University of Cambridge in 1961, and geography has remained his primary home discipline throughout his career, even though he's been extraordinarily wide-ranging in his work. He taught for many years at Johns Hopkins University. He returned to England in the late 1980s and early 1990s to serve as a professor at the University of Oxford. And then in 2001, he took up his present position at CUNY. He's the author of far too many books to begin listing here, but I would feel remiss if I did not mention a few: The Limits of Capital in 1982, The Condition of Postmodernity, 1989, A Brief History of Neoliberalism in 2005, and most recently, The Enigma of Capital and the Crisis, The Enigma of Capital and the Crisis of Capitalism, which appeared in 2010. When Jim English and I planned this series on adaptations, we felt it was crucial to address the theme of capitalism. After all, capitalism is nothing if it is not adaptive. Indeed, if the theory of evolution has sometimes been pressed into the service of the analysis of capitalism, it bears remembering that, in fact, Charles Darwin's breakthrough idea of competition came from reading Thomas Malthus, a political economist. There is no shortage of praise for the adaptive capacities of capitalism. Neoliberals would celebrate these as signs of capitalism's power of innovation and growth, and possibly nothing less than the expression of the human spirit's imagination and yearning for improvement. From the vantage point of neoliberalism, what Joseph Schumpeter once called creative destruction has often been celebrated as the positive, triumphal power of capitalism. Yet even for Schumpeter, who was no friend of socialism, creative destruction was at best a very mixed thing, ultimately for him threatening the very survival of capitalism. And more distantly, reaching into a more distant history, it's important to recognize that creative destruction, in fact, is a central idea, if not phrase, in Karl Marx himself. After all, Marx writes in the Communist Manifesto, the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. David Harvey has restored the idea of capitalism's creative destruction to its proper place in a critical theory. He recognizes the inseparable relations between capitalism's dynamism, its instabilities, and tendency toward periodic crisis, and also its efforts to manage these contradictions and crises. As a geographer and urbanist, Harvey has written pioneering inquiries into both the spatial and temporal dimensions of these processes. In tracing capitalism's continuous efforts to overcome the limits to profitability, he has described, for example, a time-space compression in which increased speed of turnover, innovation of ever faster transport and communication, and flexible accumulation drive an ever more frantic pace. Likewise, he has analyzed the urban space as a spatial fix for periodic crises of overaccumulation, seeing in the built environment a mechanism that absorbs huge amounts of surplus capital. Questions of spatiality have also fueled Harvey's theory of globalization. Globalization, in Harvey's view, can be seen as the ultimate form of time-space compression. Globalization allows capital investment to move instantaneously around the globe, devaluing fixed assets and laying off labor in one urban conglomeration, while opening up new centers of manufacture in other, more profitable sites of operation. Globalization, in this view, does not resolve capitalism's crises and contradictions, but merely moves them around geographically. Contra Thomas Friedman, Harvey's globe is not at all flat, but it's very uneven and it's very shifting. Space matters in this analysis, not only to capitalism, but also to the resistances that capitalism provokes. We invited David Harvey to pen months before the Occupy Wall Street movement began. Clearly, the Occupy movement highlights the urgent need to interrogate the meaning of space in capitalism. Space not just as a medium through which capital flows or becomes fixed, but also space as the indispensable site of contestation. In a recent piece on Occupy Wall Street, Harvey underscores the movement's rootedness in what might be called the most basic tactic of democracy, and I quote, "To occupy a central public space close to where many of the levers of power are centered, and by putting human bodies there, convert public space into a political commons, a place for open discussion and debate over what that power is doing and how best to oppose its reach." Close quote. The capacity of this tactic to provoke those at the levers of power is more than clear in the stunning willingness to employ force, even if that force is dressed up in a language of concern for cleanliness, hygiene, and public safety. So I won't say anything further. We have a very provocative title this evening, The End of Capitalism, with a question mark. I'd like to welcome Professor Harvey.
So thank you for that introduction. It was very interesting. You're frustrated. I've been frustrating a lot of people. I recall back in the 1990s I was told that Marxism was dead. And I said, well, actually, I think I'm still alive. and since then I've been riding up a storm just to prove them wrong. It's been a rather great experience. I'm not quite sure where the title of this talk came from. I'm not sure I gave it. Maybe I did. It was a little while ago, and one of those euphoric moments I said, But it immediately tracks me back again to the middle of the 1990s when I first heard the commentary that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And I heard it from Donna Haraway at that time, and since then it's been attributed to all kinds of people, so where it originated I have no idea. But I think it's worth thinking about it, and I thought, since it was easier to talk about the end of the world, I'd skip this capitalism bit and talk about the end of the world. And you then feel much more reassured. But there's something serious here which I did think I'd like to reflect upon, and so when I saw the title I thought, well, maybe I should think about this, which is, why is it so hard to imagine an alternative to capitalism? What is it that's happened that puts us in a situation where it seems there is no alternative? And when I say there is no alternative, of course, I'm thinking back to the woman who coined that phrase, which was Margaret Thatcher. And she said, there is no alternative. And she said about trying to prove her point. And Thatcher, I think, is an extremely interesting figure for precisely this reason, that she said, I'm not simply out to change the way the economy works and crush the unions, and well, she didn't say that, but I mean that was what she was really saying. Change the institutional arrangements. She said, I'm really out to change the soul. I'm really out to change the way in which people understand their relations to the world, and I'm out to change the conceptual universe in which people live. And it's very interesting to look right now, and this struck me very, very forcibly just recently when I was in Chile, where one of the other heroes of neoliberalization, General Pinochet, operated, where actually you realize that while Thatcher is no longer active in the scene and Pinochet is gone, Pinochetism, if you like, still rules in Chile, big time. Thatcherism rules big time. That actually this idea that there is no alternative has become so deeply embedded in our psyches and in our consciousness that we cannot imagine that there is an alternative to capitalism. And not only there's no alternative to capitalism, there seems to be no alternative to the kind of capitalism we've got. Now, that point about there being, being easier to imagine the end of the world was said to me first in the 1990s, when the need to think about alternatives was not so clearly apparent. I mean, the economy was booming and things seemed to be going fine. Alan Greenspan was busy sort of Delphically saying how the world was doing great. So at that time, it was hard to imagine alternatives. But you would think, after we've been through what we've been through since 2007 or so, that the idea that there is no alternative would surely be sort of thrown to one side. But what I find instead is that actually, at this particular historical moment, there's a tremendous bankruptcy of ideas as to what to do. Back in the 1930s, when there was a crisis, there was at least an alternative theory lurking in the wings, which was, Keynes and Keynesianism and state involvement in the economy. And okay, there was a big battle, and there were also social movements at that time, which genuinely envisaged some mass alternative. I mean, there was the idea of socialism, communism, all those kinds of things were bubbling around. And so in the 1930s, there was a clear sense that there's an alternative, and as things went on, there's got to be an alternative. And ultimately, after World War II had kind of solved the economic problem, after World War II, an alternative emerged in which the state was heavily involved, in which taxation rates, for example, in this country were very high. I like to remind people, I mean, we're told by the Republicans that high taxation rates destroy growth. The taxation rate on the top income brackets in this country in 1945 was 92%. Okay. It never fell below 70% until Ronald Reagan brought it down to 30%. Between 1945 and Ronald Reagan, the average growth rate in the United States, well, particularly before the crisis of the 1970s, was around 4 or 5% per year. In other words, this was one of the most successful boom periods of American history when the top tax rate was always at 70-odd%. Since Ronald Reagan, the tax rate has always hovered in the top tax rates hovered in the 30%. And what's been the average rate of growth since the 1970s? It's been about 2%. So don't tell me that high tax rates are inhibiting